Okay, so I think we're live. I never know if we're always live when I say we're live, but
All
all
right.
right, we are live. We're joined this hour by Mike Chavez, a professor, organizer, writer, academic. Wears a number of hats, and we're very, very excited. And we're going to hear about each and every one of those. But before we begin, can you tell us, Mike? Can you tell us a little bit how you got involved in higher education, and
Sure.
can you tell us about your educational journey?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks for having me. It's an honor to be part of the group of wonderful people that I've been seeing you speaking with, and you're kind of exploring some of their journeys and their histories. So I'm a sociologist by training. I started my career in higher ed almost 20 years ago. I as a student at RCC, Riverside City College, I got my eyes really open to how awesome, thinking about teaching would be and what it would mean to kind of pursue some of those academic goals long term. I come from a background. I have a lot of teachers in my family, so that's one of the things that I kind of stress is that when in my classes when I talk about inequality and poverty and all those types of things, I'm not trying to pretend that I'm something I'm not. I come from a relatively privileged background with two parents that were teachers. My mom was a kindergarten teacher. My dad was a middle school teacher. But I also come from a family of folks who did a lot of social justice work. And so I feel very privileged to be standing on a lot of shoulders in terms of the work that I do. So like my godfather and godmother were the founders of the National Hispanic Scholarship Fund here in Riverside. And my uncle was a principal and administrator for Riverside Unified School District, which was actually the first school district in the nation to voluntarily desegregate. And my uncle was one of the people that was brought on by the Department of Education to serve desegregation papers and served as the very last principal at Casablanca Elementary School when it closed in 1965, ironically because of desegregation. Right, they just figured it was easier to bus the little Mexican kids out to other schools. And so, I've always kind of had that in my blood and I've had that in part of my background. And I've always really, as far as I can remember, on some level, even if I didn't quite understand it when I was little, I always had kind of that in mind of what it would be to be one of those people who could make change and who could access large groups of people and talk to an audience, and especially just being a teacher, being an educator. And so when I was a student at RCC, I had some really charismatic and very dynamic professors in psychology and sociology, and they really encouraged me to pursue that, and I felt that it was really something I could do. And so I transferred to UCR, got a degree in psychology and ethnic studies, and it was there that I was exposed to some really, really amazing, brilliant professors, Marxist professors, other critical studies scholars in ethnic studies, and I was like, this is exactly what I want to do. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. And so, at the time, ethnic studies at UCR didn't have a PhD program, so they had the sociology program had a lot of faculty that worked between the departments. So I said, well, I'm going to apply to sociology. I'm going to get a PhD in that, and I did. And I back in 2007, I started teaching in the Cal State system, Cal State LA for 7 years, Cal Poly Pomona for four of those same 7 years. And then I landed a tenure track gig at Cal State Long Beach, which I was there for 5 years, and I loved it. I loved it. It was wonderful, wonderful. But what I realized was really missing from a piece of the puzzle for kind of reaching a lot of my goals and the things that I really had wanted to set out to do was that I wasn't part of my community. It was great working in Los Angeles and Pomona and Long Beach, but that's all LA County, and there's some amazing work that's being done out there, amazing organizers. But I'm born and raised, and I continued to live in Riverside this whole time. And so, that was just really something that was missing for me, is being able to work in my community. And so, at the end of 2019, I had started talking with some of my long-term organizer friends that were doing some amazing work, and there was a major overhaul happening at the Central Labor Council, which is the local like federation of unions, part of the AFL-CIO, and they started talking to me about some goals that they wanted, and they wanted to build some training programs, and they wanted to develop a training institute, and they kind of approached me and said, is this something that you might be interested in helping us out on? And I was like, man, I can't think of anything better. And so I left my job at Long Beach, to work full time as an organizer out here, serving the Inland Empire. I mean, my community, my home, my something that it's my front and backyard. Being able to work and across different missions, right? Working with social justice, um, environmental justice groups, immigrant rights groups, um, all types of wonderful work that needs to be done in here. And so now I'm kind of sitting in between both of those worlds. So I teach sociology at RCC, Riverside City College. So back where I began, which is really really cool. And so I can do a lot of work, recruiting some of my students and having kind of more better connecting them to their own communities, but my main work right now is developing a training center that's, hopefully in the next year after quarantine and everything else, is going to look something similar to like what the LA Community College District has with their trade tech, right? And so we want to create a center in partnership with RCC. That's why I'm keeping my foot in the door over there, in which we can actually get people as they're coming out of high school and going into the workforce, but being union minded and having the financial and legal literacy to be out there and understand what it means to fight for a contract, to organize workers, and to do all that kind of work. And so it's so necessary, especially when some of our communities out here in the Inland Empire just are dying. I mean, it's a really, really sad thing just traveling through the Inland Empire, especially in places like San Bernardino that's on the verge of bankruptcy, and knowing that something needs to be done, and we have the ability and the talent and the skills and the resources, hopefully, to be able to uplift those communities in a real material way that hopefully can be sustainable and help a lot of people over the decades to come.
Yeah. So can you I mean, like right
So
now in this,
yeah, that was a whole lot. So yeah,
no,
we
no,
can.
no. In this period of time right now, it's so hard for people who have completed their masters, they want to do their doctorate, they go on to this, and the idea is to go teach, right?
Yeah,
And it's so very difficult for people of this generation to land a tenure track position,
yeah,
and yet you were able to do that, and you walked away.
yeah.
Can you tell our audience just how difficult it is? I mean, because I want them to understand. I'm not saying like, oh, what a hero. I'm just saying like,
No, no, no. Of course, yeah,
it's a rare thing you did, and I want them
yeah.
to understand. I want people to understand, for those who might not be familiar, just how difficult it is for people, let's say below the age of 40,
Mm-hmm.
below age 45, 40, like how hard it is to come by one of these tenure track positions in this day and age.
Yeah, it's really difficult, and it's especially depending on what kind of what your goals are. A lot of people who are outside of academia really don't. And I'll say this: until I was in it, I didn't get it either. Right? How really hierarchical, how complex, how in many ways problematic, right? Systems of higher ed can be, right? So so some of the work that I was doing, kind of, it touches on this what you just asked right now. Some of the work that I was doing as an academic was really kind of using my privilege that I had as a tenure track faculty member, because it's a very, very privileged position to be in higher ed, to kind of reflect on a lot of the experiences that I had when I was what we call a so-called part-timer, right? Which is really a misnomer, right? In the United States, 75% of all college professionals, instructors, are what are known as contingent faculty. So they exist off the tenure track, right? So they don't have access to job stability, to benefits, to they're getting hired quarter by quarter, semester by semester. It's really really precarious work. I personally have had a dozen friends with PhDs that teach full loads, but they're considered lecturers or part timers or contingent faculty that are homeless, living out of their cars, right? And so higher ed is a really really messed up system in that way. And so to be able to land a full time tenure track job, um, is a really really difficult thing, because a lot of the people that are competing for these jobs, may have 10, 15, 20 years of teaching experience. But the problem is that's not what most schools and universities are looking for. They want to know, can you publish these things that appear in academic journals that nobody but like a dozen other academics are going to read, right? You can publish these wonderfully accessible, eloquent, profound pieces, books and poetry and artwork and creative thought pieces and editorials that reach the masses and probably have much more of a deep impact in creating social change, but universities don't care about that, right? They want to know, can you publish an academic journal? And so, as a part-timer, that it pulls you away from that, right? If you're teaching, they call it being a part-timer, but I remember there were times I was like teaching double and triple loads what a full-timer does. I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. So let's say here at UC Riverside, the major university, UC, that's not too far from my house, somebody on the tenure track or a tenured professor may teach 4 classes a year. My last 2 years as a quote unquote part timer, I was teaching 20 classes a year.
Yeah.
And so, good luck trying to write your book. Good luck trying to write a rigorous journal, that nobody's going to care about when you want to do, you got to pay bills. And so, it was a lot of sacrifice. I don't have kids, and I gotta acknowledge that that's a lot of privilege, in academia, being a man, being somebody who, doesn't have, the added, labor that this society stigmatizes placed on me to be able to do the work that was necessary to land a job like that. But at some point I just realized that, we can, there's only so much that you can do in a classroom, and really true education for people exists well outside of the classroom. And that was it was missing from me. Like just the fact that for me on a good day, traffic was still an hour and a half each direction, every single day, that's 3 hours at least out of my day back and forth that I wasn't giving to my students, that I wasn't dedicating to organizing in communities that I cared about. Right. And so, that compiled with, I got tired of dealing with very elitist administrators where I was at, and, gatekeepers. I was just like, this is the time. This is the opportunity. I'm not one person that usually says, things happen for a reason. I don't put much like into these kind of, supernatural causes to things, but man, there was just, I was like, there's something going on here. This is a sign for me to walk away and to do this type of work. And so, to walk away from that was difficult at first. To make the decision was difficult, but once I made it, and, talked with my family and my partner, and we had a lot of heart to hearts, I knew it was the right decision. Because just even on a personal level, if I want to think about it that way, being able to organize in my own community and work with the people that, my neighbors and workers that, uplift, Riverside and San Bernardino counties, it's so much more fulfilling than anything I was doing, that existed just inside the confines of a classroom. So yeah, going, walking away from it, making the decision was tough, but something I have yet to regret.
So you said something in that's kind of interesting. 75% of faculty, of teaching faculty is
Yes.
is not adjunct. You said something else. You didn't say adjunct. You said
Contingent faculty.
contingent
Yeah.
faculty. Contingent
Yeah.
faculty.
Which includes adjunct. Yeah.
Okay. So 75% is contingent. What is the numbers on what are called non-traditional students?
I'm sorry. Ask the question. What was the question?
What percentage of college students are fall into the category of non-traditional?
That depends. That depends on how you define non-traditional. So the language in academia, non-traditional generally means like older students who are returning, maybe people who've are had a career and have come back, or decided to take a gap year after high school, but then didn't come back till 20 years later or whatever. But that's kind of the sanitized version of that term. I think when we think about non-traditional, I think about how we imagine, how we envision what it means to be a college student, what it means to be, in the university, in the ivory tower. And so, I think about, throw around that term diversity, right? I think about it in terms of, how many brown students are there, how many black students are there, how many, in higher ed there tends to be more women, but I think that doesn't reflect somehow that they're still not non-traditional. I think that, and what I mean by that is that the traditional student often gets imagined as like the middle class Ivy League white student, walking around with, a trust fund and a good big, huge bank account. And
Yeah.
so that's growing and growing. And for me, when I think about those types of things, you also have to think about it geographically, right? What does it mean to be a student in Southern California at a public institution like Cal State LA versus, at Stanford, in the Ivy League, or even, at UCLA. And that can, again, but like I said, what it means can mean different things to different people. And that's a growing number. It's increasing in terms of, the student representation that doesn't look like what we've been taught to think about, what we've been taught to picture by movies and pop culture. And so if you're looking in Southern California, the overwhelming majority are non-traditional students, right? Especially you consider Hispanic serving institutions that have to have, a minimum percentage, 25, 30%, or even more might be Latino students.
Yeah.
Riverside, UC Riverside for years has had the right to brag that they're one of, if not the most diverse university in the nation. And they pride themselves on that. But then the moment you ask, well, what about inclusion rather than just having representation, all of a sudden that conversation stops, right? Higher ed loves to have the bodies of brown students without having the commitment to brown communities. And so those are, so I guess to answer that question, I mean, it has to include all those types of things. And it's the overwhelming majority are non-traditional.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they have full access and are, full integration into these very elitist institutions.
Right. But if you were to define traditional as 4 year straight from high school to a 4 year college, right? The
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming majority, even across the demographics, or would be non-traditional students. So
Yes.
it's just such a bizarre way of talking. Well, we have like contingency faculty make up 75% of the faculty,
Yeah.
and non-traditional students make up something like probably 60 to 70% of the students.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what are we even talking about at this point? What are we even talking about? It's just
Right.
bizarre language.
Yeah. Yeah.
Describe the
Absolutely.
majority of people as like kind of like, well, people have struggles, but like, no, this is everybody. What are you talking
Right.
about?
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
and on top of that, I mean, we're the real. I mean, I really don't like using the framework of diversity, because I think that doesn't really get at the heart of the issue. But even when you look at, representation along racial, gender, sexual, religious diversity among faculty, it exists among the contingent faculty. It exists among the people that don't have access to stability, don't have access to benefits and good stable pay, right? And when you look at, any university or school I've ever taught at, it's the contingent faculty that often get the highest response rates and the highest approval ratings from students, the most beloved people that students, will often reflect on and saying that, that they offered me something that other professors didn't. They spoke to me, they knew my background, they knew my community. And yet those are not the professors, those are not the faculty that universities really, really value, in a material way, right? I mean, it's the ones that bring more prestige because they've published in some high-end journal or written a book that got published in some high-end academic press, that again, very few people are probably going to read those books or articles. And so it begs the question: what's the mission of these universities if it's not? It's students, right? Students are the backbones.
Yeah.
Students are what make a university run. See what happens if we were able to organize a student walkout for 1 week, right? See how these universities would crumble, with just that amount of, let an administrator walk away, let an administrator get sick, let an administrator go on vacation for a month at a time, and nothing's going to happen. But students walk out, good luck functioning.
Yeah.
That's just not going to happen.
Yeah. So I have a friend teaches over at CSUN, Gabriel Gutierrez. He's actually the chair of Chicano Studies. And I remember him talking to me about this stuff, and he talked about you have to. It's not just a question of publish or perish. There's a possibility of publish and perish,
Yes. Yeah.
because the people that run these academic journals, they want to hear what they already think. So you
Yeah.
end up forming yourself to like
Yeah.
what it is, and then after that, you produce this thing that is so mediocre, that is so.
Oh yeah.
I don't like buzzwords like mediocre. It's just so standard. It's just so basic. It's just like what everyone else has said.
Yeah.
And then the only way to get published is to say what everyone else has said. the way they already said it. So then,
Yeah.
what the
Yeah.
hell? What was the point of even writing this, right?
Right.
And
Right.
that's how it appears to a third party audience, right? Like, okay, it's just another article saying the exact same things, blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
That was the
Mm-hmm.
only way to get published. The only way to get published was to do that. And
Right.
so all the originality and creativity an individual might have gone.
Yeah.
But they didn't do this and whatever. So now they did it, and now they're just looked at as this cookie cutter or
Yeah.
whatever. So that's
Yeah.
a thing into itself. And then I remember talking to another person who was teaching. I think they might have been faculty. I don't know if they were. I don't know if they had tenure. Teaching at Cal State LA, and he was writing on the Western, and his whole thing was that wait a minute, like these are racist.
And it was a profound.
Yeah, and he got this was racist. He couldn't get it published anywhere, because there was a commitment to not publish that Westerns are racist, right? By academic journals that wrote on Westerns. And he specifically was looking at like Peckinpah, I think. And so like that was just kind of like you can't publish for what you want to say. They make you say a certain thing, and then you look average. I think you froze. Oh, we're gonna wait a moment to be rejoined by Mike. Yeah. Yeah. All right, we're gonna wait a minute because we've lost Mike for a second here. Hopefully we get him back. If not, we'll do a part two. But right now we are just waiting on Mike. This has been a pretty good conversation, so I hope that we don't lose him. Let me see. I'm gonna send him the link again, and by time. Hope everyone's enjoying this. This is really interesting information to me. So. Like conversation. It's just very interesting because sometimes we think of academics and we think of higher education. I mean, not everybody thinks of it that way, but like sometimes we're kind of taught to think of academics or our higher education as like not necessarily a very like. Here we go. I'm just stalling. I'm like, and in typical fashion, I think that. All right, we're rejoined. We're rejoined. Yeah.
Okay,
So yeah, I
cool.
was just saying that oftentimes people think about like education as like these
Yeah.
bastions of
Yeah.
privilege, of
Yeah.
wealth, of like disconnected from the community, like you should be so lucky, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we're talking about people living in their cars, in the case
Yeah.
of students, and we're talking about people living in their cars in case of the professors. So
Yeah.
this is not disconnected from like
Yeah.
like
Well,
what happened to me.
which is one of the hugest paradox of higher ed, right? Is that there was a study that came out of actually a friend of mine who's a social work faculty member at Long Beach back in 2015. Really,
We lost Mike again. So in 2015, something really interesting happened, and we hope to hear about it again. If we keep having technical difficulties, we'll have to just bring Mike on for another time. I know that he only has till 6 p.m. to talk today, so we may have to do that. So we're gonna wait for a minute or two. Hopefully, get Mike back. Here he comes. 3, 2, 1. Oh, there you go.
so sorry about that, man. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go.
Okay.
Deliver the information.
All right. So what I was going to talk about was that a major landmark study found that 1 in 10 Cal State students faces housing insecurity, right? And I think that even though that might sound less terrible than say homelessness or being unhoused, right? It's a much better kind of grasp at the realities for what it means for our students today, right? Because a lot of students living out of their cars or couch surfing or don't, stay at one relative's apartment, for a week and move to another place. They don't see themselves as homeless, but I mean, they're housing insecure. And that's something that the imagined college student, the imagined university student, or what we call the traditional student, isn't really seen as, something that they traditionally have to face. And that's faculty. I had a very close friend who was a faculty member with a PhD for 25 years at Cal State LA, and was on the verge of getting evicted, had her cell phone cut off, had her electricity cut out. I mean, it was a horrible situation for, and the thing is, that's not uncommon. We hear about these terrible stories all of the time. Think about, there was a story a couple years back in New York when they had a particularly like brutal winter, and there was a faculty member with a PhD who was found frozen in her car. And the paramedics, thought, they wanted to dismiss her as just a homeless woman living out of her car, and not that she should be privileged because she had a PhD, but I mean, if anything, the surprise that paramedics and the doctors and the community the surprise that they expressed really highlighted how there's a complete disconnect between what we imagine as the reality for workers across all levels, right? From the very jobs that don't carry a lot of prestige with them, to things that we assume are just these high paid bougie jobs, right? And that's unfortunately, that's one of the contradictions that I think, until we actually acknowledge that that's what's faced on all levels, right, that we're never really going to have a true class consciousness that develops kind of an understanding of what the real working class really is. I will say this: part of the problem is faculty that don't see themselves as working class faculty, as
Yeah.
working class.
No,
Oh my
definitely.
God, that's one of the worst. As an organizer, so I was an organizer. I've been a union organizer for almost 20 years now, and I was an organizer and a representative, and on the statewide board of directors for the California Faculty Association. I loved that union. That's probably the best union that I've ever worked for. At the very least, if not for anything else, that they were willing to acknowledge the previous shortcomings and they wanted to learn.
Yeah.
Right? They never tried to be perfect. But I remember, knocking on doors of some of these faculty, especially like senior faculty that had their nice offices and had big grants, and to get them to see, talk about them as if they were the working class. They didn't want to see themselves in the same position as the custodian who was, coming through on the night shift and cleaning their trash cans. And I'm like, they, whereas a custodian might be 1 month away from being unhoused, a faculty member might be 3-4 months away from being unhoused if they don't have they don't keep their paycheck. They're right there, and
Right.
they want to attach themselves to, this bourgeois class that isn't a reality, that they're not
Yeah.
attached to.
But
You know,
I've seen people do that with who are in that other position, not even tenure. Like I've seen people like who are like
oh
part of
yeah,
the contingency. I've seen adjuncts stuff
hmm
like that.
sure,
Like
yep,
I look like we want to organize the faculty and the workers, like and
yeah,
the workers. What
yeah,
the hell are you talking? That custodian's a union man. I mean, like
yeah,
he's
yeah,
you're the one that's like he
yeah,
should be worried about you, like
yeah,
in
yeah.
terms of the adjuncts. I mean, but
Raising that consciousness is probably one of the most difficult things. When I used to
yeah,
work for AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees,
yeah,
on the UC campuses, we used to work with the janitors, custodians, so the healthcare staff, some of the healthcare staff, the food workers, the maids in the dorms. But the hardest group to organize,
mm,
and I have no problem saying this, was the parking enforcement, because they saw themselves as cops. They saw themselves as a completely different class in their own,
right,
and I'm like, you're not even getting paid more than, you can't even rely on that, like some fictitious, metric to say that you're more privileged or elite than the custodian who's on the picket lines, who's on the front line, who's there negotiating contracts, who's there, raising consciousness and awareness for their fellow workers, and these parking, these folks that want to go around, and they just love the ability to punish, and they just see themselves in a class that's completely separate. But every year when they start talking about budget cuts, they weren't immune from that. They're not, their title, their job didn't protect them. And so getting them to see themselves as having much more in line with the janitors and custodians versus police officers, was such a struggle. And you see that everywhere, any place you go, somebody earns a PhD and I always tell people, I have a doctorate, but I only make people call me doctor if I don't like them. Right. If you ever hear me introducing myself as Dr. Chavez to anybody, guaranteed that person probably pissed me off, and I'm using some fictitious measurement of prestige to put them in their place. But otherwise, man, I hate titles. I hate the bouginess of a lot of these spaces that that a lot of people see as not just part of their own measures of success, but is how they define themselves as successful. Right. Even myself, like I don't generally call myself a professor until somebody out, I think of myself as an educator. I see, I'm there with the kindergarten teachers, the sixth grade teachers, the middle school teachers, the high school teachers, that are organizing to protect immigrants, to protect trans students, to protect, that are forming coalitions with the farm workers, and realizing that we do have privilege and that we have a responsibility to leverage that. Right. But the moment that somebody defines themselves only as a title of an occupation that they don't even control, right? If they get fired, they don't get to call themselves professor, right? They're really only deluding themselves and effectively like cutting their own throats, right? They're harming themselves by not forming those systems of solidarity across workers.
Right. Yeah. No. But I mean, I've seen people do some pretty great stuff, but still have that distinction in mind, like between the the faculty and the workers, right? Like that.
Yeah. And I will say this too, when I was at the Cal State system, especially at Cal State Long Beach, there is room for people to do organizing and that type of stuff. But but it's kind of expected that you still put very, very bourgeois limits on how you do that, right? So I can write about poverty, I can write about immigrant, violence against immigrants, but the structure of the ivory tower doesn't let you actually get in there and be involved in in all of these movements that are happening. It's great, we applaud ourselves when we write about a movement, when we have a chapter about some march that I went to and these are what I saw, and now my name gets attached to something wonderful that people saw on TV in terms of creating social change. But that's very different than organizing. That's very different than talking to people, talking to workers, finding out the needs of families. That is so entirely different, and that's something that gets very, very time prohibitive at the very least, right? Time prohibitive when you're working in these systems that don't care about that. They don't want you to be making trouble. They don't want the Chamber of Commerce to be calling the president and saying, you need to silence this professor. They don't want you to be a thorn in the side of the mayor and the city councils. They don't want you to be, on the news wearing a mask saying, let's burn down these buildings, right? That's in that sense, then to even define yourself as that is such a precarious position to be in, because it can be instantly taken away if you just take one step too far, which means it's not yours, right? It means it's not yours. It means you're just attaching yourself to this institution of privilege that you don't have a say in. It's not you're not one of the decision makers. We become being the, if that's not evidence that we are still part of the working class, we might not be poor doing that job, but we're still working class, right? We're not the ones that control how this stuff happens, what's getting produced, even knowledge how it gets produced, right? It's somebody else that controls that.
Yeah. So let's get to talk about your union work. I mean,
sure. Yeah.
You leave higher education. Very, very difficult to land a tenure track job. You managed to land one, but this is just too important to you. So you make that decision to leave. You leave. What is it? What are the first? What? How does that begin? Like, when you first started working, in this new position? How did it begin?
So, it actually, in a really, really interesting turn of events, really was a full circle kind of process. So, in 2018, the Central Labor Council, there was a major overhaul in terms of leadership. The former executive secretary treasurer left, and she had been there for decades, and it was kind of a one-person show when it came to that, and so there was not a lot happening. Right, the Inland Empire really, in terms of a labor movement, was really stagnant for at least 20, if not 30 years, under really poor leadership. And people just kind of let it happen because they were tired of fighting it. Well, there was an overhaul, and one of the people who brought me into organizing back in 2004 and 2005 with AFSCME 3299 at UCR was a very good organizer and friend of mine by the name of Ricardo Cisneros. He was a cook in I think one of the dorms at UCR, and he started kind of raising trouble and talking about organizing and fighting for better rights, and he worked his way up the union over the last 15 years until he was in a position to take over as the new executive secretary treasurer. And for folks that don't know, the unions generally they don't have like an executive director. That's what it's called, the executive secretary treasurer. So he's effectively what a nonprofit would call an executive director for the Central Labor Council, renamed it the Inland Empire Labor Council. Brought on one of his former colleagues who was doing amazing work up and down the state organizing workers, Celine Perez, to take over, and they created a new position. She's organizing as a political director, so she created a cooperative and democratic coalition of workers to move basically the labor federation forward into thinking about how to organize along lots of different fronts, both political fronts and organizing fronts, and dealing with with bad industry players, those types of things. And as they kept having these conversations, they said, we need something that's going to start reaching out early, before we're having to try and organize workers who've already been working for 10, 15 years. How can we build something that involves creating that class consciousness and kind of labor minded set of workers early on as they're entering the workforce. And so one of the things that they started talking about was building this like labor center, like I said, similar to what the LA Community College District has with LA Trade Tech. And that's how, knowing that I've been in the union movement for a long time, and that that I've been in academia, it's one of the hats that I wear. They said, they asked me if I was interested in approaching this and having conversations about what it meant to build that, as somebody who could kind of traverse both of those arenas. Because like I was saying, there's a lot of academics who talk about unions and talk about organizing but don't do it. And on the other side, there's amazing organizers, amazing people who are just absolutely brilliant, but the universities don't care about them because they don't have the academic credentials. And so, the formal credentials, even though they might be infinitely smarter than any professor who talks about, these types of things. And so that's how I came on. And so what I've been doing is building these partnerships, both with other coalitions, with other justice orgs, labor orgs, environmental justice groups, and also with administration and faculty at RCC, to see how we can build apprenticeship programs, pre-apprenticeship programs. We're in talks about developing Center for Civic Engagement that's gonna do training on what it means to be an organizer, to do nonprofit work, and also developing a labor studies curriculum into as a lot of students that go through the community colleges. In fact, depending on the community college, sometimes the majority of students who go through the community college, they're not on a traditional academic pathway. They're there to get certified in welding and in HVAC and these careers that at one point were much better paying than they are now. Were much more stable, had strong unions. But for the other ones that are thinking about transferring to the university and getting their bachelor's and going on, how do we create a group of students that realizes that that's going to come with a lot of privilege and a lot of political power, that hopefully are prepared to leverage that to create change in their own communities. Every single semester I have dozens of students asking, how do I get involved in things? And it's amazing to me how, and it's not a fault of them, right? It's just how little awareness of the movement that's happening already, right? How many organizations, how many unions, how many affinity groups, how many, people are actually doing this on the ground, organizing behind the scenes and just getting them plugged in, right? And how can they actually, use their college degree not just to get a better job, but actually to make sure that their own families, their own communities, their own neighborhoods are much more sustainable, and can resist things like gentrification, can resist things like austerity measures, can resist things like over policing and police violence and ICE coming into their communities, and realizing that they have power to do stuff like that. And so for me, it was an absolute dream to be able to enter this and say, well, my passion is working with students, and how can I marry my history of union organizing with that in a real material and tangible way, rather than just talking about it, right? So, I've taught labor studies for years. I used to teach at different schools, and I would teach, classes on activism, classes on organizing, classes on collective bargaining and contracts, but it was just talk, right? It existed in the four walls of a classroom. But, and so the opportunity to actually institutionalize this in a way that actually has measurable, visible, tangible effects was just something that I hadn't dreamed of 10 years ago. And now it's what I get to do. It's what I get to do. And it's absolutely wonderful and amazing. I'm just very, very lucky to be able to do that.
And where can people connect to this work and what you're doing? Where can people connect to it, support it, find out more about it?
So so there's lots of stuff. So we're always putting out calls for people to get involved in terms, and these are, we're not asking for volunteers. Every few months we have, paid opportunities for people to get involved in doing union campaigns or political work or phone banking, those types of things. And people can always reach out to the Inland Empire Labor Council, and I can send you the information. The easiest email is info@ielabor.org. We do a lot of one of the things that we're growing that hadn't been done in over 20 years is a lot of mutual aid work. And so we've been running a bunch of food banks that are open not just to union members but to entire communities. And the more that we do, we're seeing more and more people that we've never met before that are just so excited to be able to help out. Right. And they say, people that just feel obligated in a sense of community, I think that's what I feel, that say, if I'm going to come here and get stuff that you've helped put together, I want to be able to turn that around and be able to help other people. And so we are having a food bank coming up next Saturday at the see, I have the flyer right here. I'll send this to you too, if anybody, and I can post it if anybody wants to see it. At the UFCW 1167 office. UFCW is the United Food and Commercial Workers. At their local office in Bloomington, on 855 West San Bernardino Avenue. And again, I'll send this out. But this is an opportunity for communities that are struggling right now. This is an opportunity for people who are worried about feeding their kids, putting clothes on their backs, that are already, worried about if they're going to be able to pay rent, that we can try and at least help them get through the next couple of weeks. And this is growing. We're hoping to reach over 1,000 families this coming up. And more info can be found at that email address as well, info@ielabor.org.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you, Mike. I know that you had to get off at 6, so I want to keep a man of my word.
Yeah.
But sounds to me like you need this council needs some artistic input as well. So maybe
just for down the road, once we get through this and the budgets are a little more secure, that's on the agenda coming up. Some more kind of creative work, some more connections to other building some of the coalitions. We work with some of the arts communities in San Bernardino. But I think we could grow that a lot. And in terms of just kind of creating a vital community, that's so important, right? We can talk about organizing, we can talk about food banks, but if we don't get people in their spirit, we don't get them created, culturally, and make them feel connected in this way that kind of transcends just, reactive struggle. There's only so much we can do. And so that is absolutely something that we will be pursuing in the very, very near future.
Well, when you're ready, let's talk.
Oh yeah, you're on the list. Trust me. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike. I'm sure we'll be talking soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Matt. Appreciate it.